This afternoon, we are now in Lesson 8, which is the destruction of Jerusalem, Part 4, and the final part. We've been on a bit of a hiatus, obviously, through Easter and through to Ascension and Pentecost, but we're now returning and finishing this fateful event here and now, specifically in AD 70. Just to give you, again, just one slide of a very brief recap from what we finished with last time, and that'll be the following, which is regarding the changing of the proverbial guard in Rome. So the Roman Senate proclaims Vespasian, who's the one who's been conducting the broader part of this campaign of the Jewish-Roman War. He goes back and leaves back to Rome to claim the emperorship, and is then eventually defeats his enemies and is proclaimed emperor on the 21st of December in AD 69, ending the year of the four emperors as we know it. And that particular year of the four emperors, which there was four Roman emperors, including Vespasian, within roughly 1 year period between 69 and 70. You have then Vespasian now residing back in, of course, Rome. It causes a kind of comparative lull in the fighting going on, and so there is a time not of peace, and it certainly shouldn't be thought of peace. It really is just simply a lull in the military campaign. But nevertheless, what ends up occurring as a result of Vespasian having departed from Judea to go back to and claiming the imperium is that now Titus, who's his son, is placed in charge of the Roman military efforts there in Judea. He is now in charge of the Roman forces at war. Titus is the one who would go on to become emperor after his father. It was a brief reign, so Vespasian rules from AD 69 to AD 79. His son Titus then rules from 79 to 81, and then followed by Titus's younger brother Domitian, who then rules for about the next 15 years or so. But nonetheless, this is the changing of the guard in Rome. It's the end of what we call the Julio-Claudian dynasty, founded by Augustus, the first emperor, or by Julius Caesar, depending on who you asked in Rome those days. Now this is the beginning of the Flavian dynasty. That will become important, particularly in regards to Titus, by the time we get towards the end of today's lesson. Okay, so more on that kind of as we go through. But the focus here today is on the siege of Jerusalem itself. This is the climactic event in the Jewish-Roman War. It brings about the effective end, the perhaps what we might call de facto end of the war. Not literally, because there is some spurious, spontaneous, uprisings and kind of skirmishes over the next 2 or 3 years after this event, before that's eventually completely quelled and crushed in AD 73. But in reality, this war has gone for 3.5 years, between AD 66 through to this point in AD 70. And so, what we're going to be looking at today is that particular siege and all the horrors that occurred. It's worth pointing out, we've pointed out it before, but I'll point it out just again. A number of the details in this particular lesson today are going to be graphic, because history is graphic, but it's important. I'm not doing it in a trite fashion or unnecessarily. I'm doing it and including a number of these, particularly now references to the work of Josephus in his work, The Jewish Wars, which is an eyewitness account of the entire Jewish-Roman War, and particularly the siege of Jerusalem. The quotations we're getting from that work of history are to help us understand what happened, and then for us to be able to reflect upon the important theological lessons and impacts that this event in history had. Okay, so just making sure that you're aware of that. Again, I'm not going to belabor them, but we'll discuss them and we'll talk about them, of course, as we go through. So, the Judean provincial government, which, to remind you, was made up of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, it had collapsed, and we'd seen that. It collapsed in AD 68 with the Zealot rebellion, and the Zealots and the other radical, violent factions had very much taken over by this point. They are the rulers of Judea, and of specifically and particularly of importance to us, Jerusalem itself. They are not united, though, in any capacity. In fact, they're the very opposite. They are very much divided, even in and amongst themselves. And a lot of the horrors and evils that we see come as a result of the factionalism, even among groups like the Zealots, particularly and specifically. Their tyrannical control of the city ends up spiralling it into utter chaos. And that's very much what we're going to be seeing today. Now, it's worth pointing out also that Jerusalem at this point in history has a normal population of what we think is about somewhere in the realm of 200,000 people. Okay, that's outside of high holy days like the Feast of Tabernacles or the Day of Atonement, things like Pesach, right, Passover, where you have Jews from all around Judea, as well as even beyond all around the world, who would come, of course, to Jerusalem, to the temple, to celebrate Passover. And so at that point, when you have those kinds of pilgrimages, so it were, that occur during these high holy days, particularly, most importantly, Passover, Jerusalem can have a population of well over 1 million. Okay. When I say Jerusalem having a population, it's not like they're all literally within the city walls. They're encamped all around Mount Zion and over in of course, places like Bethany and Bethphage, which you may be familiar with from the Gospels, near the Mount of Olives to the east. They're camped all around in the towns and villages surrounding. So, pardon me. It can swell up to a massive population that gets into the 7-figure mark, and that's exactly what we are, in fact, going to actually see occur for us in this particular lesson day, because the siege of Jerusalem itself begins on the 14th of April, which in this year of AD 70 is exactly 3 days before Passover. So it occurs during, for us, obviously, of us as Christians looking back, this would be, for us remembering the event of the crucifixion, this would be Holy Tuesday, okay? It wasn't a Tuesday in that year, but it would be the equivalent of what for us when we look back on the Passion Week, from Palm Sunday, of course, leading into that final week of Christ's life. This is it occurring basically on a Monday or a Tuesday, okay? So it's right in that time period. It's right before the Passover. And so you have Jews all from around the place who have come to Jerusalem, even amidst the war, on top of all the other Jewish refugees that Jerusalem had already taken in over the course of this war, who had been displaced from Judea and Samaria and Galilee and all those places. Does that make sense? They've already retreated back down to Jerusalem because, other than some surrounding areas, Jerusalem is basically the last place not under Roman control at this point, okay? And for that you can probably reference back to the maps that we've had in previous weeks, particularly the last lesson that we covered. And so it begins on the 14th of April. You have all these people here, and so it's just filled to the brim with people. That's important to remember because it can help us try and make sense of some of the death tolls that we'll see later towards the end of the lesson, which we'll discuss further when we get there. But despite this kind of, in light of this, with the power and might of the Roman army being what it was, even the fact that it was being commanded by the future Emperor Titus, the thing that we're going to see today is the fact that these horrors, the evils that occurred during the siege, were ultimately far, far worse in the city than anything that was coming from outside the city at the hands of the Romans. And you're going to see that in kind of vivid detail today. And so, moving forward, what we end up having is you have the Romans successfully surrounding the city. You may recall in previous lessons back during the campaign of Gallus, early on in the war, you had them surround the city by explaining to you that there's this massive historical anomaly where, for absolutely no explicable reason that we can find whatsoever, the Romans, even though they had surrounded the city a couple of years ago under Gallus, all of a sudden just decide to retreat back west, back towards the coast. And I explained that was really an act of God's providence in his fulfilling of what Christ himself had said in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 and Luke 21, etc., that when the warning he gives to the church, to the Christians, that of this great tribulation that was about to befall Jerusalem, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, flee to the hills, right? Flee to the mountains. And that's what they did. They fled to Pella, which is a mountainous town in the east. And that occurred because the Romans retreated. And so I mounted the argument that was an act of divine providence on God's part for the Christians in the Church of Jerusalem to be able to actually flee everything we're going to see coming down the pike today. But here, when the Romans surround, they very much will not retreat, as we shall see. They position the 5th, the 12th and the 15th legions on the western side of the city, which was the primary side that they were going to be attacking from and besieging the city from, and we'll explain why in due course. And you then have the 10th Legion positioned on the eastern side, and they were stationed on the Mount of Olives itself. Okay, as a major city in that time period in the 1st century, it's already a massive city. It's a very well-known city. Even by the 1st century, Jerusalem is already ancient, even by their standards. It had 3 walls. Okay, we referenced in the sermon today, of course, we referenced Jericho and its great walls and the great fortifications of many of those ancient Amorite and Canaanite cities. Here, Jerusalem is no exception. Jerusalem is a major city in the eastern part of the world. Pretty much it is the preeminent city in the eastern half of the world, and that was even the view of the Romans. Very wealthy, very big, very well fortified, and it had 3 walls that encompassed it, called, that we just simply refer to as the third wall, the second wall, and the first wall, and we'll see how that kind of works. And from the interior wall, which is the first wall, to the outer wall, the third wall, the structural rigidity and defendability of those walls decreases. Okay, so the inner wall, the first wall, was the biggest, the thickest, and the most easily defendable. The third wall, by the time you get out to that, was the weakest of the walls. Okay, it was built in the time of King Agrippa I, who rules Judea from AD 41 to AD 44. We've covered him before. He wanted to build a massive wall. In fact, what would have been the biggest wall in not only Jerusalem, but probably one of the single biggest walls, city walls in the world. He had plans to build a wall that was going to be 5 meters thick, not 5 feet, 5 meters thick, and would have been virtually impenetrable for any technology that existed in that day. He decides not to, back in the early 40s AD, primarily because he is good friends with the emperor. Again, he was, at least for part of his childhood, raised in the imperial house, and he decides not to do that because he doesn't want to have that come across to his friend the emperor as a kind of seditious affront. Why would you need a gigantic outer wall that would be one of the biggest in the world when you're good friends with Rome, right? Do you understand what I'm saying to you? So I think that's largely a kind of just one of those things along the way that's an act of providence, because what we're going to end up seeing, and I'll reference it later on, but what you're seeing is that the Romans break through the third and the second, right? So the 2 outer walls, they break through those 2 outer walls literally in the first 3 weeks, okay? And so I think that's probably an act of, again, divine providence on God's part through history, setting the stage for this judgment that was coming upon them. And so I'll make reference to figure 1 now. We'll reference it again later. But figure 1, you'll see there if you turn through your pages in your study notes. Figure 1 there gives you a good outline of the structure of Jerusalem at this time. It's what we call the old city these days. Jerusalem obviously being much bigger than that now. But you'll see there encircled, I've progressively colorized them in yellow, orange, and red respectively for the third wall, right, the outer wall, the second wall, the middle wall, and then the first wall, which is the inner wall itself there in the red. The blue arrows are showing the progression of the Roman siege as they moved through, okay? So you may recall I mentioned that the 5th, the 12th, and the 15th legions were stationed to the west, okay? This map is obviously oriented north. And so you have them breaking through on the western side through the west end of the gate, what we call the Gate of Jaffa. at that particular juncture of the old city, and they break through that, and then they come through the second wall. Now, pointing out here again, you can see as you kind of follow your way along that map in Figure 1 that when we say walls, it's not like they're concentric circles, right? So it's not like there's a ring of wall and then a ring around that and then a ring around that, okay? That's not usually how ancient cities were built. They were defended they were walled and defended in the places where an attack was most likely to come from. It was not easy to besiege Jerusalem at all from the south or even from the east, okay? It was much easier to besiege city just based on the topography, okay, of the land, to besiege it from the west. And so that's why it's walled to the west and to the north in that respect, okay? The temple complex, you'll see it on the eastern side of the city, the temple complex there, and you can notice the little gold area it's tiny, but you'll see it there. Is the whole that's the inner court, that's the Holy of Holies there, alongside the Antonia fortress, and that's where they eventually break through. But that complex of the temple complex, which we call the Temple Mount these days, is part of the inner city. Okay, so it's within the first wall. Okay, the biggest, the most heavily defended wall. And so again, we'll make reference to that later on. So, continuing through your study notes there, being a large and wealthy city, as I mentioned earlier, Jerusalem had not only more than enough supplies, but it had more than enough food, particularly, to feed the city's population for at least months and months and months, if not potentially probably years even, okay? This is tremendously important to understand because of what then happens as a result, because a 5-month siege is not even remotely uncommon. It's a fairly normal length of a siege of a city, particularly of a city, let alone a town, but particularly of a city. A 5 or 6 month siege is not uncommon by ancient standards, even by medieval standards. For a city like Jerusalem, though, it is uncommon. Okay, for a city like Jerusalem, as big as it was, as rich as it was, and as well structured and defended as it was, a 5-month siege is actually quite short. And it's extremely important to understand that they had enough food and resources to hold out for years if they wanted to. Okay, a siege, ultimately, we explained this before, but a siege is ultimately basically a game of bankruptcy. Okay, you're basically trying to cut the besieged town, or in this case city, off from the outside world. You cut off its supply chains, you cut off its food, its access to resources, you cut off its pipelines for troops, like for reinforcements, mercenaries, whatever it happens to be. You cut them off from the outside world and you basically bleed them dry. That's the point of a siege. And you hope that you have enough resources to outlast them. Otherwise you're going to have to go home, which is how ancient and medieval warfare used to work before we started printing paper that we call fiat currency, where we can just infinitely print it and supply endless wars, unfortunately. Point being here is that more than enough resources. However, the radical factions like the Zealots were not happy with this, okay? Particularly because the more moderate factions, again, the Judean provincial government has fallen. The Pharisees and the Sadducees are not in charge at all anymore, but they're still there in the city, okay? And there are, of course, many of the citizenry, like the civilians, who are sympathetic more towards the moderates like the Pharisees and the Sadducees than they are the extremists or the radicalists like the Zealots or the Sicarii. And they are very much wanting to negotiate, certainly by this point, during the siege. Once the siege begins, they're very much wanting to negotiate with the Romans to basically sue for peace, okay, to bring an end to hostilities. The Zealots will be having none of that, to say the least. And so many of those prominent Pharisees and Sadducees were murdered by the Zealots. They were taken out, as well as many of their supporters among the citizenry, those who had become basically weary and tired of just years and years of brutal warfare by this particular point. And so what you end up having is that the Zealots, specifically referencing them in what can be described perhaps as their fury and their fervour, they actually burn the entire city's food supply. or virtually all of it, okay, almost all of it. They tortured almost all of it, for the express purpose of basically forcing the people in Jerusalem to basically fight or die. Does that make sense? They're trying to drive them to basically a survivalistic drive to fight. Okay, and so they knowingly, willingly burn the food's city supply to get them all to fight. So a siege that could have taken years is now, as history tells us, only going to happen and is going to be successful in the span of 5 months. Again, there's more of the providence of God in that, which we'll address kind of later on in the lesson. But nevertheless, this is what they do. And so, of course, as I'm sure you can probably imagine, this descends Jerusalem into an absolutely horrific famine that really had the most devastating consequences. Famines are something that are almost entirely unfamiliar to modern Western man, which, praise God in many respects for that, of course. But at the same time, it doesn't help us when we're trying to gain a perspective of what a famine's like. Famines are one of, and there would, I perhaps suggest, be even an argument to make that a famine is just about the worst thing that can happen to a society. People do extraordinarily morally debased things when they're starving. Okay, and you're going to get a first-class lesson in that today, because the death and the suffering and the just utter, complete, total societal collapse that befell Jerusalem and the Israelites as a result of this famine is something that had never been seen, not just in the history of the Israelites, but there have been more than a few historians and church historians particularly that have suggested that there's never been such a horrifically disastrous famine and societal collapse like what occurred in Jerusalem ever. Certainly at least not in the ancient world, for sure. And a lot of that was driven, I mentioned the kind of factionalism among the zealots who were ruling Jerusalem in such a discombobulated fashion in these days. It's really split between 3 different leaders, 3 different kind of cult of personalities, so it were. That of a man named John of Gishgala, another one Simon Bar Giora, and another one, the third one, Eleazar ben Simon, or Shimon. These 3 men, these 3 zealots, are controlling and ruling over 3 different factions of the zealots. They're fighting among themselves just about as much as they're fighting against the Romans. And so whilst this siege is going on, Jerusalem itself, inside the city walls, is not only in a state of practical anarchy, it's also, in one sense, in a state of civil war. Does that understand? So you've got anarchy ruling, but also a civil war going on inside of a city that's currently being besieged by the Roman Empire. It's just like the layers of chaos are just almost endless. It's just kind of like a fractal. The further in you zoom, the more it just keeps opening up. And so when we get references in some of the quotes we're going to get from Josephus, an eyewitness, when he references John or when he references Simon, this is who he's referencing, okay? Right? John of Gishgala or Simon Bar Giora or Eleazar ben Simon. So just keep that in mind kind of as we kind of continue to work our way through, okay? So the things that we're going to read of now, and the kind of things we're going to see, and these are the kind of things which we have recorded for us in history, not only by Josephus, who again is an eyewitness to this whole thing. He's involved in this. He's on the Roman side by this point, but also other Roman sources as well, like Tacitus particularly account for these in shorter detail. But you have unfold throughout this siege and the famine that erupts in Jerusalem. You have murder, including like humongous massacres sometimes in the course of thousands and tens of thousands. You have rampant, widespread, common sexual assault and rape. You have torture. You have sacrilege in the temple. You have infanticide just break out over the entire city. You have rampant sexual immorality, like widespread rampant sexual immorality, apart from even just the sexual assault, right? There's just complete massive outburst of homosexuality and of transgenderism, and as well as finally cannibalism becomes practically universal, including what we might use in colloquial terms these days as vampirism. There is a clinical designation of that these days, to a degree. But vampirism, the drinking of blood. Okay. So when I gave you the kind of forewarning, these are the kind of things that we're going to see. Okay. So just be prepared for that. I'm going to read first to you from a quotation from Josephus, from his account, The Jewish War. I'm going to read specifically from Book 5, Chapter 10. These are not in your study notes, otherwise the notes would be 20 pages long, but read along or listen along, and it's on the screen for you, as you can see. Okay, so this is regarding specifically the famine and some of the effects on the moral behaviour of what happened as a result of the famine. Okay, so Book 5, Chapter 10. Quote, "It was now a miserable case, and a sight that would justly bring tears into our eyes, how men stood as regards to their food. While the more powerful had more than enough, yet the weaker were lamenting for want of it. But the famine was too hard for all other passions, and it is destructive to nothing so much as to modesty. For what was otherwise worthy of reverence was in this case despised, insomuch that children pulled the very morsels, right, the little remains of food, that is, right, from their own fathers' mouths, so that their fathers were eating out of their very mouths. And what was still more to be pitied, so did the mothers do to their own infants. When those that were most dear were perishing under their hands, they were not ashamed to take from them the very last drops that might preserve their lives. And while they ate after this manner, yet they were not concealed in doing so, but the seditious everywhere came upon them immediately and snatched away from them what they had gotten from others. For when they saw any house shut up," right, so closed and trying to batten down the hatches to protect them from people raiding their food stash, when they saw their house shut up, this was to them a signal that the people within had gotten some food. Right, put a target on your back. Whereupon they broke open the doors and ran in and took pieces of what they were eating almost out of their very throats, and this by force. The old men who held their food last were beaten, and if the women hid what they had within their hands, their hair was torn for doing so. Nor was there any commiseration shown either to the aged or to the infants, but they lifted up children from the ground as they hung upon the morsels they had gotten and shook them down upon the floor." That is, just going to pause there for one sec to understand what he's saying there. That's euphemistic language for basically bashing infants to death to take food from them. There is some evidence to suggest, although we're not quite sure, there is some evidence that suggests that perhaps what's going on there is they are actually killing people, and then additionally, not that this is the reference here, but references elsewhere, to then basically cutting them open to take the food out of their stomachs. Okay. Dropping children on the floor is getting along those lines, okay? Torturing and killing children to get food from them. Where are I? Yeah, but still, they were more barbarously cruel to those that had prevented their coming in, and had actually swallowed down what they were going to seize upon, as if they had been unjustly defrauded of their right. They also invented terrible methods of torture to discover where any food was hidden, and they were these to stop up the passages of the privy parts of those miserable wretches, and to drive sharp stakes up their fundamentals. Again, euphemistically describing genital mutilation as a method of torture to reveal where's your food kept. Okay? Yep, and a man was forced to bear what is terrible even to hear, in order to make him confess that he had even but one loaf of bread, or that he might discover all but a handful of barley meal that was concealed. This was done when these tormentors themselves were sometimes not even hungry. For the thing that may have been less barbarous, for the thing may have been less barbarous had necessity forced it upon them, but this was done simply to keep their madness in exercise. So what he's saying is that the unrestrained evil devolved to such a point where they would torture you, people would torture other people in Jerusalem just simply for the fun of it. Do you understand? We're shocked when we hear the word torture and fun used in the same sentence, but that's what happens when when evil and chaos break out. And so that's the ending of that reading from Book 5, Chapter 10 of the Jewish Wars by Josephus. That is just one portion of Chapter 10 from that book. We could be here all day reading stories just related to the effects of the food element. Okay, I've explained this before. I can't remember what context, but I think I've explained this before. There is another story from that Josephus gives in his historical account where the Romans have now broken into what we're going to see later on. They've broken through the first wall into the inner part of the city itself. And as they're rampaging through the streets, a group of Romans from, I think, the 10th Legion, don't quote me on that, but either way, a group of legionaries alight upon a very foul smell, okay? And they're like, oh, what's that? And so they try and trace to the source of the origin of the smell. And this is amidst Jerusalem burning by this point, massacre going on left, right, and centre. Again, we're going to come to that later by the time we get to the end. But amidst all of this, they come across this woman who we're just given her name, Miriam, which is the in English Mary, a common name in Hebrew, and she's there, near what we think is her house, and she's eating some meat, and she offers some meat to the Roman soldiers. The Roman soldiers then rather quickly realise that the reason why there's such a foul smell is because she's killed her young daughter and is now eating her. Okay, cooking her and eating her. Right, this is the kind of cannibalism that I was referencing earlier. Cannibalism had become universal. Cannibalism going on left, right, and centre. Okay, mothers killing daughters, fathers killing sons, brothers killing sisters, children killing grandparents. Pick some order. It's going on left, right, and centre. And there's just widespread cannibalism because that's what happens when famine occurs. But moreover, this is not just famine kind of going on. There is a real demonic element to what's going on here as part of this judgment. But we'll reference that a bit later on, kind of as we move through. And so the horrors of this famine were kind of shocking enough. And again, the stories like we had there from chapter 10 of book 5 of the Jewish War by Josephus is just one of like myriad stories that are just like that one. And he's just giving a little snapshot amongst many, many other instances as well. But as horrifying as the famine and its consequences were, the thing that was even worse was the widespread, just straight up demonic immorality that basically had descended. It really is, and I put it there in the notes for you, it really is hard, almost impossible to actually like overstate how bad things had actually gotten. It really is hard to actually overstate it. The worst things that you can probably envision were actually going on. And they were well beyond the context of just acts of desperation. Like that's what Josephus was pointing out there towards the end of that quotation, right? Is that torture and raiding and looting and pillaging and raping was going on even among those who weren't really that hungry at all, right? Who actually had enough food. They were just doing it for the fun of it by that point, okay? So that's what I'm kind of referring to in regards to what Josephus mentioned. The horrors of the evil that descended upon it, that can only be described as demonic, as an unleashing of demonic possession that God allowed as part of the overall judgment on the city where the Lord was crucified. Okay, that kind of cross-reference we get to particularly the language used in Revelation chapter 11, for example. This was judgment that had been foretold not only by Christ but by the prophets of what would happen if apostasy came about and if people were unfaithful to the covenant. This was judgment coming at the hand of God. And it wasn't the first time this has happened. Again, God using pagans to bring judgment on the Israelites has happened before. It happened, of course, with the Assyrians. It happened, of course, probably most famously with the Babylonians, where we're told explicitly that the Babylonian conquest was judgment, right? Punishment against Israel for her sins that had been going on for centuries by that point, going all the way back even to figures like Jezebel and such. How greater than the judgment coming down upon the city that received the Messiah, God incarnate, but yet murdered him. Again, we'll cross-reference stuff like that later on as we kind of move through. So by this point now, you've got these kinds of absolutely atrocious moral evils. I'll read to you from another section of the Jewish War by Josephus. I'll read to you from Book 4, Chapter 9. So again, follow along on screen. This is regarding some of the rampant violence, torture, and sexual immorality that's been seen, okay, in this time period. So, from chapter 9, quote, "Now this Simon," again, this is one of those readings where Simon and John are referring to John of Gishgala and Simon Ben-Gera. So, "Now this Simon, who was outside the wall, outside the first wall, the inner wall, right, but inside the other walls, who was outside the wall, therefore outside the temple complex, was a greater terror to the people than the Romans themselves, as were the zealots who were within it, more heavy upon them, the citizens, than both of the other." Right? So Simon Ben-Gera and the zealots outside of the temple complex and the inner wall were already themselves doing worse things to the people and among the people than the Romans were doing. And then even worse yet, John of Gishgala in the interior, in the temple and the inner city, was worse again. Okay. For during this time did the mischievous contrivances and courage of John of Gishgala corrupt the body of the Galileans. For these Galileans had advanced this John, right, they promoted him and made him very powerful, who made them suitable requital from the authority he had obtained by their means. For he permitted them to do all things that any of them desired to do, while their inclination to plunder was insatiable, as was their zeal in searching the houses of the rich, and for the murdering of the men, and the abusing of the women. The abusing there is the word that we'd probably use to say rape, but it's the same context. The abusing of the women, it was sport to them. They also devoured what spoils they had taken, together with their blood. Now again, references like this are what lead us to come to the conclusion that there was also rampant vampirism tied in with the cannibalism, right, and the willful drinking of human blood. Okay. There are other more fleshed out, pardon the pun, references to blood beyond that one, but that's one that we think maybe is referencing that. And continue on, and indulge themselves in feminine wantonness without any disturbances till they were satiated within. Feminine wantonness is a reference that Josephus is making to homosexuality. Okay, men sleeping with other men. Okay, without any disturbance until they were satiated within. While they decked their hair, moreover than just homosexuality, while they decked their hair and put on women's garments and were besmeared over with ointments, right, so fragrances, perfume, and that they might appear comely, they had paints under their eyes, so wearing makeup, and imitated not only the ornaments, jewelleries, but also the lusts of women, and were guilty of such intolerable uncleanness that they invented unlawful pleasures of that sort. Okay? So the zealots, and many others and all their supporters, rampant transgenderism. Dressing as women, hair, makeup, jewellery, fragrances, and then raping women, raping men, sleeping with each other. All these things have nothing to do with I'm hungry. Do you see what my point is? Right? This is straight up demonic, not just even influence, possession, like rampant possession. It's an unleashing of judgment. Okay. Moreover, continuing forward to that same quotation, and thus they did roll themselves up and down the city as in a brothel house, right? So just open public sexual immorality, like sex in the streets while the Holy Ghost dies, and defiled it entirely with their impure actions. While their faces looked like the faces of women, they killed with the right hands of men. And when their gait was effeminate, right, so their walk and their mannerisms, they suddenly would attack men and became warriors and drew their swords from under their finely dyed cloaks and ran everybody through whom they alighted upon. To run through is to stab and to cut and to kill with a sword. However, Simon waited for such as ran away from John and was the bloodier of the two. And he who had escaped the tyrant from within the wall was destroyed by the other tyrant that lay before the gates, right beyond the inner court in the second one. And so that all attempts of flying and deserting to the Romans were cut off as to those that had any mind to do so. Escape the temple complex and the rape, torture, cannibalism, genocide, all that stuff. Escape that from John and the zealots within the first wall, and you're going to get done in the exact same way by Simon and the zealots inside the second and third wall, right? Outside the temple complex, in other words, right? Even if they were within the first wall, still outside the temple complex. And so even if you were trying to escape to the Romans, who at this point were doing things in their besieging that weren't even remotely close to the evil being conducted inside the city, if you were trying to escape to the Romans, you'd still get cut off by Simon and the other zealots outside the wall, right? It's kind of like how Christ said in the Olivet Discourse, that again, many shall seek to find death in those days, but they will not find it. Okay? They will seek to be put out of their misery. They'll seek escape, but they won't be able to find it. They will suffer under the judgment that's coming upon them. If you want a specific, again, reading through particularly this quotation from Book 4, Chapter 9, and then reading a parallel to the beginning of Revelation chapter 9, where you have this odd kind of imagery given of those who have the faces of women, but who are wearing crowns, right? The zealots, because they're ruling in those days, and yet they have they're roaming around like lions, devouring people. This odd kind of reference to like lions with faces of women and stuff. It's useful to parallel history because that's what it's there and helps us to understand. But again, that kind of reference from Book 6, Chapter 4, Book 4, Chapter 9, I should say, is something that is again replete throughout Josephus's account. That's also, by the way, using a translation that has it's a translation of a writing which itself is a formal history, and so it's not. It's you can see it reads in a very not sing-songy way, but a very kind of formal way of speaking. Okay, especially when we translate it into English, the brutal reality of what those words are describing, like, really needs to be kind of seen there, and so horrific sexual immorality, transgenderism, like blatant. Just turning the streets into a practical brothel. Okay, as I explained to you earlier, the Romans broke through the first and the second walls in the first 3 weeks, again because they were much less defended and far less thicker than any of the other walls. And so by the time you get to late August, okay, so the siege runs through to September the 8th. By the time you get to late August, they then eventually break through the first wall, okay, the inner wall of what we call the upper and lower city, uptown, downtown Jerusalem, if you want to think of it that way, in the old city, as well as the temple complex, and they break through the Antonia fortress, which was the most likely place that you would try to break through in that context, break through with a battering ram, which is what they did. And so once they've broken through into the temple complex and therefore into the inner portion of the city, the rampage of the people then really kind of takes off in terms of the Romans, the destruction brought by the Romans. A fire was started in the temple complex in the city that then spread throughout the whole city. It's where we think it's probably not accidental, because someone definitely threw a lighted torch into a place they shouldn't have on the Roman side of the equation. So that was definitely purposeful, but we don't think from the historical record that was the intention, because as far as we could tell from the Roman sources, they didn't want to annihilate the city. Like, they actually wanted, because again, this is a wealthy city, it's a major hub of politics and particularly economics in the east. Jerusalem is like the gateway for the Romans to the eastern parts of the world, like the Parthians and Bactria, which is like modern day Afghanistan. And so we don't think that they wanted to destroy it, but some foot soldier down the rung somewhere threw a torch and ended up lighting the city up, or a number of them did. We don't think Titus gave that command. But anyway, point being, a fire started because because, well, quite frankly, because God wanted it to. And so a city starts and it begins to spread, especially through the residential sections of the upper and lower city, particularly the upper part. And so now you have utter chaos. You have Roman troops completely rampaging and pillaging through the streets. It's the literal definition of anarchy and chaos, and at the same time the city is being burnt to the ground. Okay, in the siege, I mean, as they flooded through here at this portion of the siege, like tens of thousands of people are dying in burning homes, dying already from all the other thousand things that are going on, like the famine and the plague that had come about as a result of the famine, because again, when people get famished, they then get sick. There was a plague in the city that we think was a number of different things. Tuberculosis was probably going on. There may have even been, depending on how we interpret some of the writings from Josephus and Tacitus, there may have been even the plague, like Yersinia pestis, that resulted in the Black Death in the Middle Ages. That may have been in the city. These kinds of names weren't around back then, so it's a bit hard for us to tell. But there was a plague going on as well. So you're either dying because you've been burnt alive in buildings, you're dying from the plague, you're dying from starvation, you're getting killed by the Zealots, or you're getting killed by the Romans, or both, and everything else in between. Just utter chaos in which tens of thousands of people died. Again, just to remind you back there to figure 1 of that movement, so you can see there the Antonia fortress on the northern side of the temple complex that they eventually broke through, and then rampaging through the temple complex then opens up into the rest of the city. And so the forces broke off at that point, some invading into the upper city, which is obviously the northern end of the inner part of the city, and then the other 2 branches running down into the lower city. Okay, most of the residential places, well, wealthier and poorer places in the upper and lower city, respectively. So utter chaos just running its way through. So, following through from there, let me just reference another part of, and the third and final reference for one of the last references for this afternoon, coming from book 6, chapter 4 of the Jewish War by Josephus. And so this is regarding the area now where the Romans have broken through, and this is right at the tail end of the siege where the greatest destructions are occurring. Quote, as the legions, right, the Roman legions, charged in, neither persuasion nor threat could check their impetuosity. Passion alone was in command. That's a reference to the fact that there was a breakdown in the command integrity among the Roman troops. So the actual the reigns of the upper commanders, centurion and above, all the way up to Titus himself, started to break down because basically the Romans went into a bloodlust, where major portions of the legions that had broken through lost any constraint, and it was just simply, if it moves, kill it. And so that's what he's referring to. Passion alone was in command. And so we know from Josephus and even as well from Tacitus, there was a breakdown in the command integrity, what's called command integrity, right? The breakdown in the actual integrity of the command structure to keep troops disciplined and on task, right, or on mission. This was bloodlust. So, crowded together around the entrances, many were trampled to death, even by their own friends. This is now referring to the Jews. Many fell among the still hot and smoking ruins of the colonnades and died as miserably as those who had been defeated, right, those who had been cut down. As they neared the sanctuary, the Romans, they pretended not even to hear Caesar's commands and urged the men in front to throw in more firebrands. Okay? So that's what I'm saying, that lower ranks of troops are the ones who are burning the city. We don't think that Titus was giving that command. But nonetheless, this is because this is all just at this point the providence of God. The partisans were no longer in a position to help. Everywhere was slaughtered. Again, partisans referring to the zealots, I should say, sorry. The zealots, no, they weren't any help anymore. They were getting slaughtered as much as everyone else. Okay? The partisans were no longer in a position to help. Everywhere was slaughter and flight, right, to fleeing. Trying to. Most of the victims were peaceful citizens, weak and unarmed, butchered wherever they were caught. Around the altar, as in the temple complex, around the altar, the heaps of corpses grew higher and higher, while down the sanctuary steps poured a river of blood, as well as the bodies of those killed at the top, now having slithered to the bottom. So like a mass piles of corpses up at the altar. The symbolism of that impactful. But more importantly, or just as importantly, you have so much blood flowing through, to the point where we get reliably recorded for us that by the time when you get into the lower parts of the city, which are literally lower, right, so they're down topographically, Roman soldiers are literally having to wade through pools of blood in the street that are at certain points knee high, because there's so much death and carnage that blood is literally running like a river through the streets. That's what he's referring to here, and that's what gets referenced elsewhere as well. It's just death unleashed, hell unleashed. And the blood of those who had rebelled against God, those who had rejected the Messiah, now flooded the temple complex itself. And their own bodies were now in and around the altar, almost in a kind of proverbial sacrifice, so it were. Again, what is going on here is the great judgment of God against those who had crucified the Messiah, just as he said would happen in the Olivet Discourse. And you have justice coming. Again, keeping in mind, Jerusalem is the city that for an entire generation now has been murdering Christians left, right and centre. They've been hunting them down. Of course, that's exactly what Paul was, right? Saul is, in his Hebrew term, his Hebrew name, that's exactly what he was doing. He was running these death squads whose job were to roam all around the countryside, hunting down Christians, right? Jerusalem has, and the authorities in Jerusalem, especially the Pharisees and the Sadducees who were in charge, for they then got ousted and many of them killed by the zealots who rose up against them. They've murdered, Jerusalem alone has murdered hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Christians by this point, in the span of about a generation, like 40 years. And this is judgment now coming upon them. The blood that they had shed cried out for justice, so it were, and now this was justice and judgment coming against them. And so what ends up happening is Titus and his Roman forces completely ransack the temple. They loot and destroy basically everything they encountered. And we can look at that and go, oh, how sacrilegious and corrupt it is, obviously. It's nothing different than the Zealots have been doing all throughout the siege. Josephus writes all throughout, plenty of other places, including some of the books that from book 5 and 6 particularly, about how the sacrilege, right, so the unholy use of that which had been dedicated for holy purpose, right, was rampant among the Zealots. The Zealots had been stealing all the sacred vessels from the temple. They'd been having orgies in the temple itself. They'd been doing all manner of sacrilegious and blasphemous things all throughout this time. What Titus and the Romans did was maybe perhaps even tame in comparison. But nonetheless, this Titus, who is the future emperor of Rome, as I mentioned, what he does is he and his soldiers, his primary guard, enter the temple, enter the court, and actually enter into the Holy of Holies. And unflinchingly, Titus, we have reliably recorded to us, actually walks up and sits down upon the mercy seat in the Holy of Holies as a proverbial kind of throne. Okay. The Roman Aquila is brought in. We've referenced this plenty of times before in previous lessons, right? The Roman Aquila is the golden eagle of Rome, the Aquila, the eagle, that was the battle standard of the Roman legion. It was the most important symbol of Rome, and we recounted in previous lessons when previous legions lost it after the Battle of Beth Horon. After they were destroyed a couple of years ago and had to flee back into Syria, they lost the Aquila, and it was a great shame. It was a massive scandal in Rome because it was the first time that it had happened since the destructive or the infamous loss at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest in AD 9, when they lost to the Germanic tribes and 3 entire legions were wiped out, 20,000 troops gone. Here now, in like almost an act of triumph and retribution, so it were, his predecessors had lost their Aquila. Now he was bringing his Aquila, or the Aquila of his primary legion, into the Holy of Holies, the symbol of the Roman imperial authority, into the Holy of Holies. And therein the Aquila is placed with Titus, and all of his troops bow down and worship him as a god. Okay, this is this is kind of the great. It's not the first time it's happened. It happened also back in the Maccabean revolt with Antiochus IV Epiphanes did the same kind of thing. But here, this is really what's being referred to by Daniel, for example, as what we call sometimes in English the abomination of desolation. It speaks not only to the desolation of Jerusalem, but also particularly the abomination of the one who enters into the holy space and is worshipped as God, that we get back in Daniel, is being here fulfilled for us. And that's exactly what Titus does. Enters the Holy of Holies, sits down upon the mercy seat of the ark, and is where the sacrificial blood had been sprinkled for, well over 1,000 years by this point. And he sits down upon that mercy seat as his own kind of ad hoc throne with the Roman imperial insignia, the Aquila, present, and is then bowed down to and worshipped as divine, as a divi, as a god. The abomination of desolation. But again, this is all part of the judgment that now this part of this place which had been revered, rightfully so, which had been built as holy for God, was now turned into a house of sacrilege and blasphemy. Not because the poor people of Jerusalem never wanted this and they were doing everything fine, but these big bad Romans came along. No, because this is exactly the blasphemy and the sacrilege and the apostasy that Jerusalem had committed. And all this ultimately is the fulfillment of that which God had promised would occur. So, continuing forth, this is why I mentioned earlier at the top of this lesson about population levels and what we think they may or may not have been. The historical numbers of the death tolls vary. Josephus indicates that all in all, across the war, and especially and particularly through the siege, which is the big where the vast majority of the deaths occurred, that around 1.1 million people died, with only about 40,000 people surviving from Jerusalem. In addition to that, about 97,000 were taken as slaves and sold primarily, or taken off primarily, to the Roman province of Egypt. I'll get back to the 1.1 million figure in a second. The 97,000, there's no dispute about that. That's almost entirely certainly accurate. The big part, though, is not so much the numbers. Really, though, is actually the gigantic cosmic irony of them being taken off into slavery into Egypt. It's like a full circle reversal of the entire history of the Israelites, where the end of their proverbial story, so it were, not literally, but you get the point, was them actually ending up back in slavery in Egypt. Okay, I don't think that's by accident. That's an opinion, of course, that you can do with it what you will. But I think that the historic symbolism of that is legitimate. Nevertheless, Titus, who's obviously a Roman source from the ancient world, he says that that the population during that time was actually about 600,000, with many or the majority being slaughtered. So again, what numbers we put to the death tolls can be debated historically, but it's hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of thousands. It's probably somewhere in the ballpark of like 500 to 800,000, probably. We don't know. You can certainly take that number at face value. Again, hubristic modern archaeologists say, it couldn't have been that. No, Jerusalem never had 1 million people, but without being smart, we kind of know that it could have, especially during high holidays, because remember, it didn't normally have a population of 1 million, but this siege began when all these people had come for Passover. Right, so it's entirely possible that there's that many people in Jerusalem. I'm also more times than not more inclined to believe ancient historical sources who were there and who are eyewitnesses over modern atheistic archaeologists, but that part aside, that I digress. Nevertheless, a gigantic number of people died here, and very, very, very few survived. And even then, many who did survive were taken off into slavery. So, this new Flavian dynasty under Vespasian, and then under his successive sons like Titus and Domitian, capitalised on this great victory that they have had over the province of Judea, which was one of the biggest military actions that Rome had engaged in at this point, certainly under the Imperium. And they used it as a big, massive part of their claim to legitimacy to rule the Roman Empire, which was very much successful. So a triumph was held in Rome for Titus, and by extension Vespasian, but particularly for Titus, because Titus was the one who really followed through on this part of this, especially the siege of Jerusalem. That was all Titus. So the triumph we've explained before. But the triumph was the grand military parade and honours. It was like it's somewhat analogous to our Anzac Day parades, except that's commemorative for us. This was a triumph of the living person, of that general who was in charge of the Roman legion, that was successful in battle, in this case Jerusalem. And so that triumph would be, he would be paraded, the triumphator, the one who was receiving the triumph, would parade through the streets of Rome in full military attire. He would be riding upon a chariot driven by 4 horses. That symbology is important because the gods rode chariots with 4 horses. Okay, he would also be dressed in purple, which is the colour of royalty. And keeping in mind that Rome, even under the Imperium, right, even as an empire, is still anti-monarchical, which is the great irony of the Roman Empire. And so purple, again, that tradition coming from the days of the Roman Republic when they hated kings, functionally and judicially, was still very much treating this great conqueror, this Roman conqueror, like a king. He would have a laurel wreath on his head, which again is a symbol of victory and of triumph, that you're probably most familiar with from the Olympic Games. His face would be painted red in the style of the god of war Mars. So all of this symbolism is just like massive, and he would then be paraded up through the streets to great cheers and elations, up to the temple of Jupiter, where he would then make a sacrifice and pay homage to Jupiter as the kind of climax to his triumph. And so this triumph occurs for Titus, who enters in as the great hero of Rome, and 2 triumphal arches were actually built in honour of Titus, the Arch of Titus on the Via Sacra, and then the Arch of Titus at the Circus Maximus. If you're familiar with the Arch of Titus, you're familiar with the one on the Via Sacra. That one comes to us in figure 2, it should be, on your study notes there. And so that's the most famous Arch of Titus, and it's Roman style. You may be familiar with the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, which was built in the kind of Renaissance style in much later times, a couple of hundred years ago. But nonetheless, over the last couple of hundred years. But this one is the Arch of Titus in Rome, still standing there to this day, very well preserved. And you'll see there a couple of things of note. You'll see there, particularly if you look there at figure 3, what you have there is the relief on the north side of the arch, and that there depicts the triumph of Titus. On the right side, you can see Titus up there on a chariot, surrounded by servants and slaves. You can then see kind of in the middle the 4 horses. You should hopefully be able to see side by side the 4 horses there, and then people around him celebrating and honouring him. You can see Titus there with wearing a toga. You can hopefully see the flow of the toga there, and again that would have been coloured purple. This is celebrating his triumph. The other side there as well, in the next, is the actual inscription that honours Titus and by extension Vespasian, but particularly Titus. And for those who can't read Latin, I'll do it for you. It says there in Latin, Senatus Populusque Romanus divitito divi Vespasiani filio Vespasiani Augustus, which says the Senate and the people of Rome, which is just the formal name of Rome, right? The Senate and people of Rome dedicate this, which is implied there in Latin, dedicate this to the divine Titus Vespasian Augustus, son of the divine Vespasian. Okay. Common language, we've encountered this before, particularly when we did our many of the kind of Greco-Roman world introductions in some of the opening lessons, that again the Roman emperors, upon their death, not while they were living, but upon their death, were considered to have been deified, undergo what we call, using a Greek term, an apotheosis, an elevation to divine status. So Julius Caesar underwent that after his death, and he was apotheotized, and so he was elevated. So therefore Augustus, the on paper first emperor, technically the people, Julius Caesar was the first, but other than that, he was then considered divi filius, the son of a god. Okay, and so that's why the language in the first century of son of God is already going on in the Greco-Roman world, and then you have the coming and the arrival of the true Son of God, and that comes up all the time in the scriptures, to the point where Paul even quotes pieces of Roman propaganda. One you'd be familiar with, that there is no other name under heaven by which men shall be saved, okay, other than the name of Jesus. That's just a straight up quote of a piece of Roman propaganda which says something almost literally to the effect of, there is no other name given under heaven among men by which you can be saved than Caesar. So that Paul isn't inventing that. Paul's quoting from Roman propaganda, which was well known, and using it in application not to Caesar, but to the true Lord, to the true King of Kings, Christ himself. This was built, by the way, the Arch of Titus was built in AD 81, after the death of Titus. It was built by his brother, his younger brother, the successor to the emperorship, which was Domitian. And so by that point, Vespasian's gone. He's been elevated to the status of God. Now Titus has too, so hence the term Divi Tito, the divine Titus. And then finally there in figure 5, there for you, this is now the south side, the south relief, the relief on the south side. And this is showing the whole point of this triumphal arch and the whole triumph of Titus, which was the conquest and the siege of Jerusalem. And you can see there, what that's depicting is Roman troops carrying back all the various goods and things that they had taken and ransacked from the temple. And you can see probably most indicatively there a menorah, which is the menorah, the golden menorah from the inner court of the temple, and that's what that's depicting there. Okay, and so very famously, so you can look through those figures as you continue reading through, and so nevertheless, have a look at those and look at those in more detail afterwards. Now, just to conclude and to finish up the lesson, what you end up having, which is something that's really, I think, of an interesting kind of side point. In the life of Apollonius, which was written by Philostratus in ancient times, Titus, we're told in that, I think quite reliably, actually refused, as part of the triumph, to receive a wreath of victory. I explained to you how a normal triumph would work, where they'd be crowned, so it were, figuratively at least, with the wreath of victory, a laurel wreath. He actually refused it in his triumph because of what Philostratus indicates to us, that as far as Titus was concerned, he had been merely the instrument of divine wrath, which is interesting. I can't remember whether it's Philostratus or whether it's Tacitus. I think it's Tacitus, who actually, in a number of key points when he's talking about the fall of Jerusalem, is talking about the wrath of God, which is interesting verbiage for a Roman polytheist to be using, right? You would expect him to be referring to the gods. So, but I think it's Tacitus, again, don't quote me on that, but I think it is Tacitus who ends up referring to the wrath of God, and this being divine vengeance against the Israelites and against Jerusalem. And Titus doesn't receive the wreath because, in his opinion, he was just the instrument of divine wrath. Take from that what you will. I think it again speaks to a lot of the things that we've seen kind of going through this whole ordeal of the Jewish-Roman war, and particularly the fall of Jerusalem itself. Consequently, as a result of all this, of course, Jerusalem is reduced to rubble. You're familiar, I'm sure, probably with Christ's very famous prophetic words of I can destroy this temple and in 3 days rebuild it. And of course, he's speaking about the temple of his body, but he says those words in the context of in and around him pronouncing that famous judgment on Jerusalem in the Olivet Discourse. The temple is sacked and is destroyed forever. It's annihilated, and the whole thing goes because, again, by God's graciousness and his blessing, under the new and greater covenant which we are blessed to be part of, the temple of God is no longer in a fixed place. This is exactly what he said to the Samaritan woman, as you may recall in the Gospels, when the Samaritan woman complains effectively to Jesus as a Jew from Jerusalem, that you Jews down there, you tell us that we can only worship God down at the temple in Jerusalem, but you don't even allow us to come down there, right? But Jesus' words were, the time is coming and has indeed come when God seeks those who will worship him in spirit and in truth, and that he shall not be worshipped on this mountain nor on this mountain, right? It's in like one singular fixed location, which is of course what the temple was. It's what the tabernacle effectively was as well, although of course the tabernacle was mobile. It was still in one singular place and would be set down there in the camp, right, where God would reside, and he would dwell among the people but not in the people, right? That's why the new covenant is not only new, but is also described as the greater covenant, the covenant that fulfills that fulfills that which was promised to Abraham and fulfills that which the prophets look forward to use Christ's words. In that now, and we explained this back at Pentecost, of course, a couple of weeks ago, that now that we are the temple of God. We are the temple of God. The Spirit of God now dwells in us, not in one fixed location. And so wherever his people go, that's where the temple of God is. Hence Christ's seemingly pithy words, but they're not. Where 2 or 3 are gathered, there I am, right? Because that's where the temple is, right? Wherever the people are, we have the great blessing and luxury of being able to build, congregate and worship God and partake in the liturgy in this nice historic building that was built over 100 years ago. But we don't have to be in this building. If we faced great persecution, like many of our Christian predecessors have, and they're hiding out in caves, literally in subterranean cities, so it were, as much as the early church often had to do, well, there the temple of God is. And then when Rome falls, or even before that, when Rome actually becomes Christian, and many of the emperors, by God's grace, start converting to Christianity, and then under Constantine and his successors, Christianity is legalized, and then eventually Rome becomes Christian. Now they can start congregating in open without having the fear of being crucified for it. Whatever end of that spectrum it is, the temple of God is where his people are, because we the people are the temple of God. And so the temple is being destroyed for that very reason, because now the concept of having continuing sacrifices would be blasphemy to the sacrifice that Christ made once and for all for the salvation of his people. At the end of the day, this fall of Jerusalem, and this is the point where we'll finish on here, this fall of Jerusalem is ultimately the judgment and the justice of the exact covenantal curses that God described as being in place back in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy chapter 28. Okay? There were covenant blessings for abiding in the covenant, right, for remaining faithful to God. But for those who apostatize, those who commit apostasy, who departed from the faith, who departed from God, they would face covenant curses. Okay, it's a part that often gets overlooked. We talk a lot about covenant blessings and not enough about the covenant curses in the Old Testament. But that's what's described. So maybe go and read Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy chapter 28 and refresh your memory and see what those are all about. Covenant blessing and covenant curses. This was not just God acting arbitrarily. This was God doing something and doing the very thing which he had foretold would be the consequences of apostasy. Right? Because at this point, the Jews have become, to use Christ's own words and the apostles' own words, they have become nothing more than the synagogue of Satan by this point. Okay? Those who, to use Christ's words to the 7 churches in Asia Minor, right, in chapters 2 and 3 of Revelation, when he's describing, say, in Pergamum, for example, and other cities, that I know of those who call themselves Jews but are not, right, but are rather the synagogue of Satan, because they've rejected the Messiah. By rejecting the Messiah, by rejecting Christ, they are by definition rejecting God. They've apostatized, they've broken the covenant. And this is the just judgment that had been foretold by the prophets going all the way back, that it said this is what will happen if you depart from God. Okay? And as well as what Christ had said would happen, particularly in the Olivet Discourse. Okay? This now being fulfilled. It was the official breaking and ending of what we would call the old covenant, and now the thing that remained was that of the new and greater covenant. And it's from this point that Christianity explodes. Right? Christianity just goes leaps and bounds and starts exponentially growing. It had, of course, been growing, obviously, in this 40-year period between Christ departing and ascending, and then now the judgment of Jerusalem here in AD 70. It had been growing. Of course, we have that in the book of Acts. But it really took off in exponential numbers, as far as we can tell from church history, from this point onward. So let me leave you with this final quotation that comes from the end of book 5. So the end of chapter 10 in book 5. It won't be on screen, but I'll just read it out to you. This is one of Josephus' kind of defining opinions of everything that went on. Quote, "It is therefore impossible to go distinctly over every instance of these men's iniquity." Which is exactly what I've said. We'd be here all day just reading the war of the Jewish war by Josephus with all these accounts. "I shall therefore speak my mind here at once briefly, that neither did any other city ever suffer such miseries, nor did any age in history ever breed a generation more fruitful in wickedness and evil than this one, from the beginning of the world to this day. Finally, they brought the Hebrew nation into contempt, that they might themselves appear comparatively less impious with regard to strangers. They confessed what was true, that they were the slaves, the scum, and the spurious and abortive offspring of our nation, while they overthrew the city themselves, forcing the Romans to act, and did almost draw that fire upon the temple, which they seemed to think came rather too slowly." Right? In other words, they were so wishing for death, so wishing for relief, so beyond caring that they're almost asking for the temple to be destroyed. "Indeed, when they saw that temple burning from the upper city, they were neither troubled by it, nor did they even shed a tear on that account, while yet these passions were discovered among the Romans themselves." So you had Romans who were like, "Oh no, don't destroy the temple, no." The Jews didn't bat an eyelid, couldn't have cared less that the temple was getting destroyed. I quote that last because that's kind of like one of the defining historical references there that we get from Josephus as to the state, perhaps the state of mind of the people, right? They couldn't care less that the temple was being destroyed. They had apostatized from God so badly and so far, right? They'd waded so far into darkness they couldn't even tell up from down or left from right by this point. And they're watching the temple of God burn, which had, this was the second iteration of the second and final, but now though, it's something that going back to the days of Solomon, of course, right, at least in terms of the first temple, something that their ancestors had cherished for obvious reasons. The very place where God had dwelt among Jerusalem, and they're watching it burn, and they couldn't care less. That is why Christ refers to them as a wicked and corrupt generation. And it was judgment that befell the city that crucified the Lord. So I've put those in your notes there, and we finish now where those different quotations from. You can find that on page 4 of your notes. If you're wanting to go and look up The Jewish War by Josephus, very easy to find online. And you can, if you're wanting to find where those specific references are, that's where they are. You can read elsewhere from it as well. I warn you when you do that, again, you're only going to encounter greater, more voluminous, and at some points even worse stories and accounts than what we had even read to us today. So therein we finish. And that's the end of this period that we've been going through. And we now move on to our march through the history of specifically the Church of God. It's very important to have seen this unfold and the reasons why this unfolded, because it's the definitive break of the old covenant and the new. It's the definitive destruction of Jerusalem and of the temple, which now had become nothing more than a synagogue of Satan, which had now been ruled by men of iniquity and of injustice and wickedness and the evil that we've kind of seen unfold before us. It's the judgment that God brought upon them, demonstrating that God is faithful to fulfill his promises, which include that of justice and judgment. And so from now, we'll actually next lesson, which is next week, move on to one of the earliest Christian documents that we actually have called the Didache, which just simply means the teaching. And so we'll start to unfold that and work our way through some of the earliest church sources that we have available to us, some of which go back even to the late 1st century itself. So, are there any questions or anything that anyone has regarding the material today? Very good. All right, thank you very much. Church is on next week, and as I said, we'll be diving into the Didache. Thank you.